As we look at the national forest, even if you don't believe necessarily in climate change, I think we would at least admit to climate difference. Sorry about that, wrong way. So I ask our folks just to kind of put together just a snapshot of looking at the rainfall that occurs in the national forest. So the purple and the blue is range anywhere between 60 to 70, 70, 80, or a little bit more than 80 inches of rainfall a year. That's average and typical, most certainly not this year. Major influences to the water quality and quantity are most certainly the wildfires that occur across the state, vegetation and fuels management, restoration, meadow restoration, and also our road management is those things that affect water quality and quality. 2013 in context. Over 1,500 wildfires burned on the national forest, 350,000 acres. I'm just going to be rounding these off as I talk. And any of those that won't can get this PowerPoint from Steve. Cost of suppression on those, $397 million. Thus far in January, 150 fires on national forest in California alone. This is just a map. You know, a lot of times when we have conversations, many people talk about the Sierras. So as we look at just the national forest in California in general, as you look at those black dots there on the map, those are the fires that occurred on national forests that are over 500 acres. If I'm not mistaken, I think we're looking at about 42 of those. So those are the fires, those black spots are those fires that are over 500 acres across the national forest in California in 2013. The rim fire direct costs, you know, I know Steve gave some figures on the suppression costs, $127 million for suppression. We spent a little over $10 million on emergency rehab with soil stabilization as a part of our burnt area emergency rehab program. And then our folks just kind of gave me some figures on the amount of carbon. So when they talk about metric tons, I really don't know what that means. Can you give me something simpler? So the amount of metric tons is about 2.3 million cars of the emissions is what was lost as a result of the rim fire. So 11.3 million metric tons, roughly about 2.3 million cars of emissions in a year is what that would equate to. This is the rim fire. Have gone out there and some vantage points with some field trips that I've taken a look at. There were places where I was unable to see any green at all. And this is truly the case, is scorched trees, a barren soil exposure for a really, really long way. I have a thing that I typically say about the indirect cost. In most cases, when the fires are burning, you know, the news cameras are there, but there's a cost of other things, particularly when that fire goes out and the news media is gone. We really don't talk about the increased runoff in the sedimentation delivery that's going to ultimately reach the reservoirs, as Steve mentioned. You got the increased flood risk, increase of the risk of life and limb, destruction of fish and wildlife habitat. That as far as we look at trying to see how much money that is, I think it's really hard to measure. The loss of recreation opportunities. Not very many people want to go and visit on a charred landscape. And those are some indirect costs, particularly in our rural communities that rely heavily on recreation users. So that really has a huge impact to our rural communities. Long-term impacts to water infrastructure is another thing, those things that we typically don't talk about in a larger context. Post-fire runoff and erosion, so you got channel routing and sedimentation, woody debris, landslides, just to name a few. With some studies that our folks kind of took a look at, the hill slope runoff increased anywhere between 2 to 1,200 times above pre-fire conditions. Short-term increases in groundwater discharges occurred. Hill slope erosion increased anywhere 5 orders of magnitude above pre-fire. And those are just some photos of really what the landscape looks like when those large fires occur. What can we do about it? We know that thinning works. So here's a picture of a fire, the cone fire that was in 2002 on the Lassen National Forest, looking at an unthinned versus a thin stand as a result of fire. If you look at the fire direction was as you see it from left to right. This is just another picture of the work. This is a fire. This is a wall of fire on the Apache National Forest in Arizona, 2011. Just looking at as that fire moved down, those areas that thinned on how that stops the wildfire. You know, for us several years ago, we looked at how do we change our business here in the region. And so ecological restoration is our priority here in Region 5, looking at how do we see about changing the landscape, making the landscape more resilient. And as a part of moving forward with ecological restoration, there are some major components that are kind of a subset of that we've got to make sure that we consider. Climate change or changing climate, whichever way you want to say it. Those landscape-wide disturbances. We know that the rim fire currently is in the forefront of many people's minds, but it's bigger than that. Just like that photo showed, those fires that are greater than 500 acres that occurred across the state. On those charged landscapes now you've got a seed bed for invasive species. And you know, it's just immeasurable on how long these large fires are going to impact those individuals that are in and around those communities and enjoy the national forest. You know, we also took a look at what had kind of occurred historically. So Brandon gave a really good example of that. So you take a look at those stands, that's what the top right is what they used to look like. Bottom left are the current situation of what many of those stands look like today. You know, we've learned that we've got to have some long-term commitments with our goals. We've got to have something that we can work and strive towards. If you take a look at this photo here, as you look at drought, the fire itself, the stress on trees, this is just a photo that shows the insect and disease. So now with insect and disease, you know, you lose the value of the timber. Those trees are going to die, ultimately lead to fuels, lead to wildfires. And so now what you've got is you've got a cycle. And in some way we need to see about trying to break that cycle. Like I said, our intent, you know, with the Forest Service, we own or manage roughly 20 million acres in the state. In a good year, right now we probably will do treatment anywhere between 160 to 200,000 acres. And based on our estimates, we really need to treat about 500,000 acres to see about getting ahead of this large issue that occurs here in California. Our current pace and scale is not going to get us there. As I just described, anywhere between 160 to 200,000, but we really need to treat about 500,000. Some of the challenges we have is funding. In 2008, 9, and 10, we were able to treat quite a few more acres as a result of having the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. And those monies were able to, with contracts that hey, we're able to treat more. Beginning about 2011, as we see our budgets decline, the number of acres that we have also decline. So that's just a slide of just showing the trend. And like I said, Steve can send this slide out, or this PowerPoint presentation out to individuals. So what do we need to do about it? We've been talking for a long time. We know this situation exists across our landscape, and at some point in time, we need to act differently. 5 minutes? Okay. Thanks, Steve. With our work, integration is going to be key. Integration not only with our as we look at collaborations and partnerships, looking at doing work on a larger landscape, but we're also looking at integration with internally too, which means how do we, in all the different resources areas, put our money together so we can meet more of our objectives in a similar location versus the traditional shotgun approach, I call it, as far as management. I think there's an opportunity for us to pool our resources to be able to make a bigger difference. That was just an example of what I talked about. So most people, when you would look at that, you would think, okay, that's somebody's probably be building a road. Yep, that's great. But what if also too, that's probably, I would say you could probably have fish passage through there if that was a natural fish bearing stream. Also could be a wildlife corridor. And so those are the kind of examples that for me, in my mind, we talk about integration. When we do something on the land, how can we have multiple benefits as a result of that? So instead of maybe engineers footing the bill for that, maybe several other program areas can also see about trying to contribute to that so we can do a lot more, a lot further, and reach a lot more of our objectives. Collaboration and partnerships, and I got not this. So I'm standing at this landscape here, and the piece that's behind us is that we're doing a meeting of collaboration with a field trip on the rim fire. And what I mean by not this, I had much rather us collaborate, and I think it's necessary for us to talk on the front end versus us trying to get together after a large fire and talk about now what do we do. Even before the rim fire, we've got 3 collaboratives in the region of looking at trying to work with different communities. I'm not sure if many of you are part of those, but we have the Dinky Creek, the Burning Hat Creek, and the Cornerstone projects, whereas they've been in place for a couple years, looking at how do you bring a lot of different interested parties together, looking at a larger landscape to see about making a difference. You know, there's a lot of different things that are kind of going on in the state, and we're trying to be a part of many of those conversations. So we're working with the Integrated Regional Watershed Program, looking at how do we use Prop 84 funds to do a lot of the treatments on the landscape, working very closely with the Sierra Nevada Conservancy, the Nature Conservancy, and many other partners. We are looking at a avoided cost on the McCullamy, really taking a look at what are those costs, and then we've got some figures that we can begin to working with the Bureau of Reclamation on their 3 basin studies. Bureau of Reclamation is not typically interested in doing treatments prior to, but we're looking and having conversations with them that maybe in their best interest too of investing prior to these large fires, so they don't spend a tremendous amount of time and money with either raising the dams or spending a tremendous amount of money cleaning their reservoirs out. Working with Cap and Trade, working with Steve Brink and a lot of others on the importance that forestry needs to be a part of those funds to be used to stop the loss of carbon. And then we also have many of our employees involved with the state biomass working group. So we're trying to be a part of many of those conversations, telling our story, as ways to see about getting more resources to help manage the national forest. This is just a photo. This is the Burning Hat Creek project, where you've got private landowners, the U.S. Forest Service, and other entities working on increasing and changing the landscape. In summary, we understand and realize that the national forests are critical to California's water resources, particularly as climate change continues to occur. We know that the significant impacts related to wildfire risk in water. We feel that the collaboratives and partnerships will help us accomplish the needed restoration work that we need to do. And a big part for us is also asking you, what ideas do you have or other ways of doing business? Because I think that will be key. I think if we all come together with all of our minds and all of our different experiences, I think that we'll be able to come up with some answers that will help us increase the pace and scale of ecological restoration here in California.